Let's start looking at some attributes that control the way the debugger behaves while you're debugging. Let's say you've been debugging a section of code that makes a lot of calls to other methods, and you want to navigate into and out of those methods to trace the path through the code. You already know from earlier in the course that you can use F10 to move through your code without debugging into those method calls, and you can use F11 to debug into those method calls. When you're moving fast, though, you might want a simpler approach to just keep hitting F11. So let's try that and see what happens. I have a breakpoint set on the code behind for the expense page. When the page loads, the breakpoint is hit. Let's hit F11 and F11 again to continue into this method call to the expense repository. It says nullable.cs not found. It looks like it's trying to step into .NET code that's inside the framework. Let's close this and continue. Same thing again. This is kind of a pain. Let's skip ahead to farther down in the code. There's a call into the repository again here. So the getExpenseTypes method. I'll hit F11. Okay, good, we made it in. I want to keep hitting F11 to move through here though. And the debugger tried to step into another framework method for the entity framework source code. Okay, so when we're debugging, we just want to step through our own code usually. So let's look at how we can configure that in Visual Studio. I'll stop the running application and let's go up to the Tools menu and open up Options. Under Debugging, General, there's a checkbox here that says Enable Just My Code. Let's check that. Now when you use F11 to navigate through your code, the debugger won't try to step into framework methods, but we can control things even more. What if you're stepping through your code using F11 to step into all the methods being called, and there's a particular method that you don't want to step into? You know there's no problem with this method and you want to just step over it. Of course, you could hit F10 instead, but if you're like me, you get into a rhythm when debugging, and you don't want to have to think about which key to press while you're focused on the code. There's an attribute you can add to particular methods in the system.diagnostics namespace. The DebuggerHidden attribute will cause the debugger to step over this method, even though you're pressing F11 to step into it. There are actually a number of attributes here, and we'll look at another important one in the next clip. But let's add this, and let's run the code again to test this out. When the app opens, let's go to the expenses page, which causes the breakpoint to be hit. Now I'll continue hitting F11, and this time I'm brought into the method in the repository class, just like I wanted. No calls to the .NET Framework code. I can keep hitting F11, and the debugger doesn't try to open up Entity Framework code either. I'll keep stepping through until we get back to the calling method on the expense page. We don't want to debug through this loop, so I'll run to cursor farther down. Now I'll hit F11 again, and we're brought into the repository. Let's continue on. And now this getMinExpenseDate method is the one that I added the DebuggerHidden attribute to, so F11 shouldn't move the cursor into this method. And it doesn't. But the next method doesn't have the attribute, so F11 brings us right into that. DebuggerHidden is just one of those convenience things that you might never use, but in the rare case where you need it, it's good to know it's available. Next, let's look at an attribute that can help you format data in the debugger.